ability and the consistency and the format of the data is key. Technological requirements through GIS. And once we can organize that, then we can come back to leadership, whether it's you all or the CEO subgroup, and we can say, this is where we are, this is what we have, and from there we can do next steps. One thing that is really clear right now is cooperation will be key. I know there's a lot of different ideas about the information that should be included or what process it needs to go to, but cooperation among localities has to be key, and kind of an investment in time and resources, not just from the PDC, but from your staff at all, to kind of build this data from the ground up so we have what you need. There's a lot of law enforcement and agency types. We're not just speaking with the locality police, but there's also tribal police, federal police, state, college, university. So there's a network that we kind of have to build, that then we can pull this data into the data that you want before we can talk about how we're going to build a tool that would take us to get what we need. So that essentially is what our thoughts are, the PDC, in order to get this crime dashboard up and running. And I just kind of wanted to share that with you so you could see the process, open up to a bit for you, and just ask your thoughts on there. Is there any thoughts or questions or ideas? Be happy to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you, Greg. So let's open it up and see what comments, input, guidance you can give us as we move forward with this task. The takeaway today, the one ask that we're going to make would be that each of the localities appoint someone that is familiar with crime data analytics, to help fill our knowledge gap on this. As Greg said, we can bring it together. We manage data well, the GIS work. But it's really important for us to know who those go-to people are in your localities to be certain this is a very sound data dashboard. So Mayor Dyer?
Yeah, I think an important consideration is that when we get our police chiefs together, I think that's the obvious, core group of, how they would, because they're going to be using the data. So I think the more input and collaboration in unity with our police chiefs getting together, I think that's a good first step.
Thank you, sir. Mayor?
Thank you. I love this approach. One of the things that we have to help with those who are collecting the data, that the information is readily available. So without, compromising any ongoing investigation, but to have the data available to those who are going to collect and code and do an analysis and interpretation and then present to us, so that we have the best possible information to make policy decisions. But collecting data and interpreting and analyzing the data is based on the quality of what they receive.
Thank you. Mr. Wheeler?
I just wanted to note for the group, if you don't already know this, the budget, or the Finance and Personnel Committee, in recommending its budget to you, which will be considered later this month, I believe, there is a small resource bundle in the upcoming budget for the PDC to begin the financial work to support what Greg just talked about. It's probably not what we will need in the end, but since we don't know exactly what we need, we were able to put a first piece in there. One of the concerns that several of you expressed at our last meeting was we need to translate the talk into action. So we heard you at the Personnel and Budget Committee, and so you'll see that reflected in the budget that you will see for the organization for the upcoming fiscal year.
Thank you, Randy.
Mayor Tuck, anything to add, sir? Can we go around the table just to be sure, from Suffolk?
Thank you, Bob. The idea of collecting these crime statistics is obviously a good start so we can see where they are. But, I was talking to Mr. Moore here just a few minutes ago. The stats themselves will give us one picture, but most importantly to me is that we look at each one of these occurrences and ask our law enforcement personnel to extend and be able to look at them and say, what could we have done to prevent that? If we had unlimited resources and prior knowledge, what could we have done in the short term to prevent that? I think what you're going to find is that in a lot of cases, there's not an answer to that. There's not a short-term answer. In some cases, there will be. So, for example, what factors allowed or attributed to this crime occurring, and could it have been prevented? Be it lights or cameras or code enforcement maybe would have cleaned it out. If this individual did not have access to an illegal weapon, was it an illegal weapon, or was it a weapon that was legally purchased and that individual was able to acquire it, that child was able to acquire it? And that would give us a lot better, to me, how we're going to spend our resources and be able to take some of that low-hanging fruit, if you will. And if it turns out a regional effort would be more productive than doing it on a local basis, then we would do it regionally, and if not, then it would be to the locality, because all our localities don't have the exact same circumstances, and if they do have the same circumstances, they will be to different degrees. So the amount of effort that would need to be placed in one city on a particular aspect of violence reduction versus another municipality may be down at the bottom of the list, because in that particular city, it's not as much of an issue. So I think to make it work, we have to try to look more into the why. And once we know the why and what attributed to that crime, could we have prevented it at all in the short term or the long term? And then that way we're using our resources as prudently as we can.
Thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Crum,
Yes, sir.
I don't want to belabor the point, but I agree with Mayor Duman. The dashboard is one thing. Having quantitative information is good. We can all look at it. But without the qualitative analysis, it's very difficult to get to policy recommendations. And so it's the questions that you ask. What are the questions that you ask? That will determine what type of analysis that you can do, whether it's going to be purely quantitative or it's going to be quantitative with a qualitative description, that we can make informed policy decisions, and the recommendations will be supported both qualitative and qualitative. So I agree with the mayor. Dashboard is one thing, but what does it say?
Absolutely.
I guess I have a question for both of you. To what level are we going to look at a locality's data to determine about a particular crime and how it might have been impacted? That seems to me that that's a local level issue if you want to analyze what happened here in terms of a robbery or a shooting and how that might have been prevented. If we see a pattern, collectively, perhaps the same individual or individuals doing it, then I could suggest that we would look at that collectively. But I can't, right now I don't understand how we can look at an incident that happened either in Franklin or Suffolk or Chesapeake or wherever and analyze on a regional basis how that one particular crime could have been prevented. So help me understand.
So, Mr. Mayor, in the data collection from all of the localities, what the researchers will do, they'll look for themes. They'll look for common themes. And through data collection, themes will emerge as they analyze the data. They'll see themes, and they're coded. And what's regional is what they will bring back. If something's good for the city of Norfolk only, I mean, Dr. Filer will probably already be on top of that, but we're looking for patterns and themes that will emerge that's happening that has a regional impact.
And I agree, and I see that one. Okay, now I'll leave it at that. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Thank you. The more information and direction we can receive, the better. Mayor Rabel from Franklin.
Thank you. I would agree that having that dashboard is going to be invaluable, I think, and really delving down into it and really getting to the causal effect of what's going on. I think probably the ancillary benefit, and probably just as important, is getting the chiefs together to really start having those discussions about common themes, the things that are going on. So I really see that as a real positive. Those smaller little places don't have data analysts to do all of this work. So it's going to be really incumbent, I think, on how we massage that data and who's doing the massaging of that data.
Good. Thank you. Well, maybe coming around, Mr. Trivett from Williamsburg, anything to add?
The only thing that I would add is I was listening to Greg talk is on the peninsula cities and counties during COVID had a fairly similar response in terms of data collection and analysis related to vaccination and also infection rates. And we did both, I think, to answer the mayor's points, which is we collected the data, which is first step, and normalizing how each locality is collecting the data and reporting out is probably the biggest challenge for Greg and his team. But then once you have the collection, there has to be somebody that is doing a sort of commonality of analysis so that every locality is not interpreting it a different way. And maybe that's the point that you were trying to make. And so for us, that effort was led by the experts in that for us, and that was the health systems. So we had a weekly call for a while and then transitioned to monthly, where we looked at the data for each locality, we looked at it regionally, and then decided what actions needed to be taken by each locality that was participating. And for us, it was really an excellent strategy in making sure that we deployed resources where they needed to go, but also addressed what we were trying to solve, which is at one point containing the.
Anything more to add from Pocosin? Over to Chesapeake, please.
I would agree that in terms of creating a common operating picture, that's key to any platform, any program, especially when you have so many different jurisdictions involved in different kinds of jurisdictions involved over such a large geography. The common operating picture would be really important. It gives us that same big picture level data. We've all got access to the same kind of data. We're coordinating it in the same way, reporting it in the same way. And then in the small scale, I think one of the examples that kind of hit me was a few years ago in our legislative program, some of the jurisdictions were talking about specific addresses within their locality where lots of crime was happening. So you have a lot of crime, but not a lot of addresses associated with it. And I sort of took that back. I was interested, should we jump on board with this legislation? And we didn't necessarily have the same analytics that some of the other jurisdictions were using to be able to pinpoint. So we do now, but it's one of those common operating pictures. When we see something, we share those best practices, we translate it into local and regional data sets, and it would help, I think, drive policy decisions, both at the regional level, but even at the local level.
Great. Thank you. So any other comments on this particular item?
I have a question, actually.
Yes, sir, please.
So, Greg, you were asking, what are we looking for? Was that part of what you were presenting and asking us what types of data that we want to know about? And if so, how are we to give that to you?
Well, I think that from what I understand from the initial discussion, right, the initial ask is, can we put this information together? When I say that there's kind of a moving target here, I think once we determine what we can get, we can go back to Dr. Filer and Ms. Bunting and say, here's our information, and through the CAO working group, they can kind of identify, all right, here's where we want you to focus initially, and then we can come back to this group to see, if what we can get matches with what we want. And again, I think that process will probably take us down the road a little bit, because as we evolve, we probably will have more information that comes available. We'll start high level, and then we'll get to really what's helpful and what's useful to the law enforcement locality and the localities.
And Mayor, part of that journey will be on Monday. I'm going to be sending out a request that each locality consider the appointment of a person from your locality that can sit with us. If you're a smaller locality and don't have that resource, that's okay. It's this group that's going to help us put this together, and we will umbrella everybody as we develop this. But if you could think about who that person might be, I'll be making that request because Greg and I are going to need to pull that expertise to the table and let them guide this for us. Okay? So any questions on that, Dr. Filer?
Yeah, Bob, I just want to make one comment because Mary and I are going to talk about this a little bit when we get to the work the CAO working group is doing. And since Greg and I have been friends a long time, I feel like I can ask him to do something. So, yeah, economist to economist. One thing that's kind of coming out in our working group conversations, and Mayor Dyer alluded to this, this knows no boundaries. Everybody is facing this. Everybody is facing these issues. But in particular, Greg, I think a data point that is missing that I know, we are not necessarily capturing in Norfolk yet either. But since all of us are doing sort of intervention strategies at some level, we aren't keeping a regional data point on crimes committed in our city by suspects in other cities and sort of where that is happening. Because what's going to happen is if I do intervention and we're going to do it. I mean, we've got the Newark Community Street Team coming in. Mary and we'll talk about some of these, and I know Hampton's doing some of this as well. We're all focused on our own interventions, on our own residents in our own cities. And I fear that in some of this we're missing that some of this needs to be a phone call from Norfolk to Hampton about, hey, we just saw some things go down and it appears as if they're happening, and then you all can circle back and say, oh, yeah, we're doing some, interventions in that particular spot, right? That's a data point I'm not sure we have at a regional level that could be pretty useful.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Okay, does that sound like a good path forward?
That is excellent.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Greg. So Greg and I will be reaching out to you. Our next step will be to convene our working group. Before we move on to our next agenda item, just very quickly, I'm going to allow a quick introduction from the audience. Mr. David Mick, I know, is with us today. Mr. Mick, would you mind just doing a brief introduction, sir, please?
Yeah, come on up.
Oh, great. My name's David Mick. I work at the Attorney General's office, and just kind of hearing what we're doing as far as a collaborative effort. I think it was a great point made by the city manager of Norfolk. That's information you need because you might not necessarily know. Me as a prosecutor, you don't know that information and what other cities are doing. So that's a great point. But I'm here just to kind of see what all you all are discussing, and I'm here to answer any questions too if you have any questions from a different viewpoint.
Thank you, sir. We really appreciate you being here with us today. Okay, let's move on to our next agenda item then. As you'll recall, at the conclusion of the last meeting, the group agreed to form a CAO subgroup that would meet to develop recommendations on next steps. And as I mentioned earlier, Mary Bunning, our CAO committee chair, led that group, and Dr. Chip Filer was a huge part of that working group. So I'm going to turn it over to them to present those recommendations to us today.
And I want to thank you all for the indulgence, and Greg in particular for going before me. I had a HRBT tunnel traffic problem, and glad that I could be here and not have to force this all on Dr. Filer. But I think we did agree we would share in the presentation. I also want to acknowledge that several other city managers participated besides Dr. Filer and myself. We did speak with, and the report we're giving you contains input from Portsmouth, Newport News, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, and Hampton. We didn't get to all of the communities in the short space of time we had. Certainly we're open today to additional feedback, but I do want to recognize our peers who did contribute to the conversation. You have before you a 2-page handout that is sort of going to summarize what Dr. Filer and I will cover. I'm going to cover the first point, and I think he's going to pick up on the second one, if I'm not mistaken. But we'll tag team it and get through it together. One of the things, and this reflects a bit on what our conversation as a group was last time, as well as additional input from the city and county administrators. The first thing we want to say is that we recognize that gun violence is a complicated issue with a multiplicity of causes. To fully address the issues, we need to properly identify the contributing factors and convene a host of participants in addressing those needs. And this sort of gets to what Mayor Duman was talking about. What is really going on in each of these cases? And when you break down cases, there's oftentimes different contributing factors, but you do see themes on an overall scale in terms of that. Policing is obviously critical, but not the only component of response. Indeed, government cannot address all the contributing factors alone. We have provided you with an exercise called a fishbone exercise diagram. It's in front of you. This is an example. This is not meant to be all exhaustive. This does include work that Hampton and similarly Portsmouth have been doing with Bloomberg Harvard around the gun violence issue. There's certainly more green bubbles that could be on here, and there's some more causes that you might want to add to it. And it is not final by any stretch of the imagination, but is rather intended to be an example of what we need to be doing at a local level as well as at a regional level, because some issues will be only local and others will be certainly for all of us. But the notion behind the fishbone diagram is to deconstruct the problem. So the problem we're identifying is gun violence. In Hampton, we've gone further to say, in Hampton, looking at our statistics, gun violence is in a concentrated number of areas, committed by a concentrated number of individuals and their associates. You could frankly identify a top 25 and focus a lot of energy on the 25 and probably solve a good part of the problem. So if you start with just gun violence, it's big. But if you narrow it and you say it's happening in these specific areas and these specific individual actors and their associates are most often the perpetrators and victims, it gets a lot easier to focus in on how you might address the issue. And then you further go down and say, well, why is that? Why is it concentrated in these areas? Or why are these individuals specifically the ones that are being victims or the ones that are being perpetrators? And you break it down to the contributing factors. So again, merely as an example, not intended to be exhaustive and not intending to speak for the region as an entirety or any individual locality for it. There are issues that research has shown are the contributing factors to gun violence. And you see on this poor conflict resolution, which we talked about last time. I think it was Randy Wheeler who brought up, gee, wouldn't it be nice if we all got behind a conflict resolution course that all of our students have to have? That's certainly a recurring theme. Another recurring theme is family dysfunction, and that can take a whole lot of different forms, whether there is a parent who is working 3 jobs and isn't there and there's no one to watch the kids, or whether there's a substance abuse addicted parent, whether there's domestic violence. But typically when you find these issues of family dysfunction, you're more likely to find incidents of violence or victimization. Mental health we talked about last time, and unaddressed trauma, really big example. Really understood example. If I can just take a moment of personal privilege and give an example, we were in New York City last week working with Bloomberg Harvard, and we had a school representative that related that she was following up on a student who had witnessed another student killed, and was following up with that family to make sure that the student who had observed it was getting counseling. And the parent said, why would they need counseling? Everything's fine, we're moving along. And yet I think every one of us knows that any one of us who would witness a homicide would likely need trauma counseling. So it's not even understood universally by parents, by students, that they need that trauma counseling themselves. Very, very big issue. Last time the group talked about the judicial system and the fact that we seem to have a revolving door of repetitive felons that are, they get locked away, they come back, they commit crime again. So how do we re-entry folks into our community? But also, how do we maybe have stronger accountability? Some examples relate of people having committed very serious crimes, being out on bond, committing another crime while they're out on bond before hearing that actual case. Concentrated poverty plays a big role when you look at hotspots, at least in many communities. And so how do you try to attack that? Access to guns. and desensitization of communities and individuals to violence and just coming to expect it in their neighborhoods. These are just examples of why this is a hard problem to solve and why we should not be focusing on it as a singular issue. We absolutely need to do our part. Policing the data we were talking about is going to be a big part of that. But we also need to be thinking about these other green bullets. So one of the things that we wanted to suggest to you all are that some of these green bullets are ones that we could have very effective conversations with our various partners. For instance, just picking mental health and unaddressed trauma. We have regional hospital systems, we have regional community services boards. We should invite them in and ask them to be partners in helping to solve that bullet, because the law enforcement community should not be expected to solve that bullet alone. And similarly, building out others. This example today is intended to get us thinking and started in our conversation, and to talk about which bullets may be missing. For instance, we talked about the fact that there are large events, festivals and whatnot, where we tend to see more crime happen. That's maybe another green bullet. But we thought this might be a good departure point for our group to start to think about how do we want to do this. And this could be accomplished in a variety of different ways. One might be having subcommittees around the different bullets that we ultimately agree on, and asking those folks to come report to us so that we get a report from the regional health system and CSBs as an example on the mental health and unaddressed trauma and what would they recommend and the best way to address that issue. So with that, that's sort of the part we wanted to say, that we need to deconstruct the problem and deal with it in bite-sized pieces. The police are certainly well on their way with dealing with street strategies, whether it's the Newark street system that Norfolk's doing or the credible messenger system we're doing. I know Portsmouth mentioned last time Project Safe Neighborhoods. And I believe our police chiefs actually meet on a routine basis. But some of these other areas don't have dedicated groups to work on them. And we think it would be very powerful for the mayors and city managers to really ask other individuals to step up and work in subgroups and come back and report to this group on things we can do around these other green bullets. In the meantime, we've suggested some regional opportunities that we think are what you'd call low-hanging fruit for collaboration and advocacy on a regional level. And that's what's number 2 on this sheet of paper, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Filer to go through those.
Thank you, Mary. So the subgroup had a really good conversation around the diagram that Mary showed, and recognizing this to be a huge problem. Pieces of this probably deserve to be regionalized and should be, some of it maybe not. And so one of the things I think we were very focused on is trying to figure out early those areas where a regional approach really will prove to bear fruit, and where we should anticipate that localities will do their own thing, but yet keep constant communication among the localities about their efforts. Again, just trying to recognize that, we don't want to force regionalization in any space where it doesn't seem to make sense. Second part of that is whether we regionalize or not regionalize, there are aspects of what we're looking at here that we're going to need the electeds to take the lead. And then there's other aspects of this where the administration can just jump on this and get moving with appropriate guidance from the elected officials and budgets, basically. And as good city managers and city administrators, we made sure that the electeds' tasks far outweighed and outnumbered the administration's tasks. Sorry, that was a joke. That's not true. It's about 50-50. But we do absolutely need a lot of these areas that we need assistance in. It's going to take elected officials at the state level lobbying for some assistance and making some policy changes, not just in local code, but perhaps even at the state level. So I just wanted to run through sort of A through I here real quick, do a quick summary of the ones you see here, and then policy or administration. The first one was convening conversations with our other partners. Mary's already talked about this quite a bit. There's a bunch of items on this picture that government is going to have a hard time playing the major role in. There are going to be policy things that will need done in order to create these partners, but administration can also take care of that pretty quickly as well by bringing in credible partners, and also, leveraging those partners' resources in order to go after perhaps grant programs, things like that, and help potentially even self-fund some of these initiatives. B is this regional support for conflict resolution. This is clearly policy oriented. I mean, this is really the electeds, the mayors and the councils are going to have to think about where this should live. We've heard conversations about it living in public schools. That could obviously be done. It could live perhaps in CSBs, though I think our CSBs and our human service departments are pretty strapped as it is with the work that they're already doing. So we are going to need some kind of policy level support for conflict resolution, and we do believe that one could be regionalized. So that could be something that gets done in every school district, every human services department, however we structure that. The judicial accountability one, again, I think that is largely a policy-oriented decision. That's something that the electeds really need to move out in front on, and it should probably be regional. I think every city faces this issue, and if there's a regional appetite to put pressure on the judicial system to make sure that we're being tough on crime, then that's something that I think the electeds and the councils can get together and rally around. The next three, D, E, and F, are really administrative things, and this has been largely the majority of the conversation that the subgroup has had. I would say D, E, and F are the big ones. We have some regional support for shared law enforcement technology. Right now, we're all individually purchasing NIBIN machines. We're all individually trying to hire civilians to analyze the NIBIN data. We've had a lot of conversation around the need, perhaps, and I think we're probably there, just given the complexity of the issue, perhaps to have a regional crime lab, where even if we all are hiring certain numbers of civilians on our staffs, those civilians are working in concert with one another. Does every city have to have a NIBIN? Can we use, a single NIBIN? We have a NIBIN, I believe. Hampton, do you guys, Mary, can you remember, do you share it with Newport News?
Hampton and Newport News
Yeah.
bought it together,
Yeah.
and we share it together.
So there's a great example of collaboration, and I think we could really take advantage of that. And this is beyond NIBIN. There's all kinds of other technologies that we have that are being used for crime suppressant that we could think about purchasing one or two of, and then allowing through shared agreements to have access to that technology. We've had a lot of conversation around each of the individual localities' efforts on what we're broadly referring to as intervention programs. We've created a partnership with the Newark Community Street Team. Portsmouth has Project Safe Neighborhoods. Mary has alluded to the one that they're doing with Bloomberg and Harvard. So everybody is looking at this conflict resolution intervention. Again, we don't necessarily need one group doing it for the whole region, but as long as whatever we're doing, it's being shared and we have good communication and that we're reaching out. One of the things with Project Safe Neighborhoods that we're doing with Portsmouth is we are sharing information on gang activity. We are seeing a new phenomenon that the group, I think the mayors are familiar with. We are starting to see city level smaller gangs actually aligning with other cities' smaller gangs, and that is creating a dynamic that is becoming a little bit more difficult to get our arms around, because we're so focused on just the impact in our city, but yet they are actually potentially working in concert across city lines, and sharing of that information is going to prove to be pretty vital. The big one that we've talked about, and I think this is low-hanging fruit that we could move on pretty quickly. It would just take our working group or our subcommittee getting together and finding out what is everybody purchasing. ShotSpotter, body-worn cameras. We've purchased 6 mobile cameras recently. We're all finding it very difficult in this supply chain environment to get things and get them quick. However, if we were to band together and try to procure things as one group, perhaps we could put a little more leverage on the companies selling these products and at the same time potentially even get a little bit better price. We think this is one that we, obviously with the approval of councils and the mayors and the electeds, that we can move forward on pretty quickly, actually. G, H, and I are largely policy ones, again, that we've all talked about. There is an opportunity. We're all sort of doing one-off interventions with ATF, Marshal Service, whatever, in our individual cities. We could have a conversation about utilizing those resources in a regional manner, so that a little bit of the activity is in Norfolk, a little bit in Portsmouth, a little bit in Virginia Beach. Again, if we think there is some evidence now that some of these folks are working together in tandem, that could prove to be pretty useful. And that's, as the same goes with our state and federal partners, to try and align gun legislation. I think that one largely falls on the electeds and trying to push some smart gun legislation. And then finally, the gang intelligence. I think I've already talked about that one. We are going to be sharing that information within our subgroup. So as we begin our efforts, Portsmouth is getting ready to start theirs. Mary and Hampton are already well underway. We would start then sharing information across. I think Mayor Dyer made a really good point, which is, the CAOs were going to do this probably every once in a while, and Mary and I have talked about this. That group would also potentially include a joint meeting with the chiefs, and you get the chiefs in the room at the same time with us, so that there could be that information sharing. My understanding from our side is that the chiefs are doing this. They're sort of doing it informally, but they are absolutely sharing information, and I think that's critical. The last one, and I want to add one bullet. We've had a long conversation about the mental health piece of this, and there's the mental health advocacy, the mental health assistance. Obviously, there's that part. We really have a legislative need for the electeds to help us uncouple our police officers from the mental health aspect of getting folks to the hospitals and having our officers sit there sometimes for 24 to 48 hours. This is becoming a massive issue. I see all my fellow CAOs shaking their heads. We are hearing over and over, and we are all already strapped in our police forces. And there is a path on this. Legislation has come up occasionally in the General Assembly to help uncouple the police force from the hospital stay. We really would urge the electeds to think about this and help us see if we could rally some support around that decoupling, because our officers are begging us to try and find a path on that. Thank you all.
Thank you. I want to thank our two CAO subgroup leads for their work, and all the CAOs that participated in that report out. So I'd like to open it up for comments, reactions, any discussion. Mayor Dyer.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll tell you, outstanding report, outstanding example of collaboration and being focused on the problem. Back in the day, and I was brought up when Leave It to Beaver was on first run, what would happen if we disrespected a cop or a teacher? The worst thing you could do that day was go home. And right now, in the societal problem, there's lack of respect and civility out there. It's been hijacked by, social networks and, everything of that nature. And I think it was Mayor Tuck alluded to the fact about doing the conflict resolution in schools. I think the other player that we have to bring to the table are the schools. Because once again, civility should start in the school. And I honestly believe, from what I understand, a lot of the conflicts that lead to violence outside of the schools starts in the schools. So I think it's going to be incumbent that, we bring the sources to the table. Not too long ago, in Virginia Beach, we started an idea commission, and that's inclusion, diversity, equity, and accountability. And we brought a broad spectrum of our community together by race, by social demographics, age, its ethnicity. And after 2 focus groups, there was one thing that really was predominant and evident is the need for mental health in the cities. And I'm going to ask Deanna if you could kindly send the PowerPoint, that was generated to Mr. Crum, and he can get it out. But I think once again, it's going to be important that somehow, and it's an overwhelming task, to get into the hearts and minds of our youth and other people in schools by leveraging the faith-based communities to help us. The people out in the communities know our communities a lot of times better than we do. To really, because to help out, we got a lot of single parent, no parent families out there, and a lot of intact families are dysfunctional right now. And also, working with people that are incarcerated that, help with a transition so they don't wind up going back to prison. And I'll just end on this. I got to talk about the other people that we got to bring to the table. It's important. It's our legislators in Richmond. And we're delighted the fact that we have an office locally now with our Attorney General. We cannot have a society when there are bad actions and there are no consequences, little or no consequences. We got to go back to the law. Now, it was my understanding that, they passed legislation that that downgraded assaulting a police officer. I don't know if that's still intact, but I think there was a, movement in that direction. And, but once again, I don't know how we do it, but getting back to civility and mutual respect in our society. Like I said, we can't do it on a large scale basis, but I think by our example and by our actions, we can start here. Thank you for letting me do that diatribe.
Thank you, sir. So I'd like to make certain every locality has an opportunity to comment on the CAO subgroup's recommendations. Mayor Alexander, any comments or reactions?
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Chip, for a well presented presentation. I look forward to bringing this report to life. A lot of good policy recommendations and things that we need to lobby our legislators for. We will do just that. I would ask if Mary, you and Chip could speak with your housing authority. It's important to have our housing authority commissioners engage. A lot of the activity that you mentioned, if you really drill down to where a lot of the activity originates, it's in a very defined place. And we could safely say in Norfolk, we have layered a lot of the problems and issues out of our public housing communities. And you may find those of you who have public housing communities or low-income areas, it's the same. So maybe we can get Dr. Filer, you and Ms. Bunning can get with the Housing Authority commissioners or the executive directors and get them involved.
Thank you. Chesapeake, Mayor West.
I'd kind of like to address the legislative aspect of it on 2 levels. We had an example this past session in Chesapeake of a fairly modest amount of money to help us with the problem, Dr. Fowler, you just mentioned, in our emergency rooms for police and for just some beds in the hospital so that the police officers wouldn't have to stay all night in the emergency rooms. And it really wasn't turned down because of the lack of money. There was plenty of money and they were willing to do it, but they felt like there was, it would set some precedent that they couldn't meet for the rest of the state, or other areas of the state might be asking for similar things. So it's not just a willingness or lack of willingness, it's pretty complicated in terms of why they're not providing us with the resources to do it. I think they understand the problem. They just can't get both sides of the aisle to agree. And so we have a lot of work to do with that. The other part of the legislature, I think Mr. Price mentioned this at the last meeting. I mean, I think this, I don't think we have too many guns. We have too many guns in the wrong hands. And they've removed some of the legislation that the last 2 to 3 years has moved the opportunities for police officers to stop vehicles where they traditionally have been able to confiscate guns that were in the wrong hands. And so that seems counterproductive to where we want to go. So I think we need to kind of concentrate on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. On to Pecosin.
Thank you. I certainly support everything that's on this sheet. I look forward to reading this one in more detail. It's an interesting challenge to actually read it, but there's a load of really important stuff there. Not to be redundant, but as we talk about people that should be around the table with us in the future, I think it's fantastic that the Attorney General's office is here today. I hope in the future that we invite them to sit up here. And I hope also that we invite representatives from our Hampton Roads caucus from the General Assembly to also be here. We need them to help us in many ways, but we also need them to understand the link between the things that they do or do not do in Richmond and how it plays out in the various cities and counties in Hampton Roads. So having them here to hear and also to help, I think would be a step forward for us. That's all I have.
And Randy, just so you know, this is a map of the New Jersey highway system. And if I can, along what you said, Bob Morrissey, who is the Secretary for Public Safety and Homeland Security, has started meetings. He met with me. I think he's getting ready to meet with Mayor Tuck. And they have expressed an interest in taking a proactive role locally, and maybe another person we can invite down sometime.
Thank you. On to Williamsburg, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I will start by saying thank you to my colleagues at the CAO levels from the larger localities for leading the effort here. Certainly, I don't have anything to add. I did want to say that in Williamsburg, we believe, like Mayor Alexander does, that the origins are important in the story. And so we've asked our health foundation, Williamsburg Health Foundation, to begin a study of recent violent crime in our region, York, James City County, and Williamsburg, to look at origins. They're enlisting help from some of the universities in the region to help us dig into that analysis so that we can start to address some of the policy issues that deal with origins.
Thank you. Franklin, Mayor, anything to add? Ms. Jarrett?
I would just like, again, to say thank you to my colleagues that worked so hard on this. Several of the items that you've outlined would be incredibly beneficial to the larger communities, to the point that was, to the smaller communities, I'm sorry. To the point that was mentioned earlier, we have found that a lot of our perpetrators are not our residents. I mentioned that at the last meeting, but it is tied to activity in the more urban centers of Hampton Roads. So if we were able to pursue joint procurement, the regional crime lab idea, my chief just stepped out, but I texted him about that and he absolutely would support it, because we don't always have the personnel or the technology or the capability to fully investigate these crimes that are committed in Franklin, but probably tie back to perpetrators in your community. So we would definitely support that. We welcome the opportunity to attend future meetings and participate in subgroups. We think that this would be very beneficial to Franklin.
Thank you. On to Suffolk. Mayor, Mr. Moore.
Again, I want to echo our thanks, Mary, Chip, and to the rest of the subcommittee for putting this together. Couple of items. I mean, I think my head was the bouncing whenever here when Chip mentioned the mental health issue, because that's why you hear from our police chief, our staff, our resources are in the tied up to 72 hours in some cases in the hospital. So that's something key. And I believe, as we've talked, the element of having starting with the schools, because that's where if you can catch them early enough and you start. Maybe it'll take us a decade, but maybe we can turn around some of the stability that we need to, that we've lost over the years. So, but again, thank you for allowing us to be participants here, and look forward to maybe working with my colleagues on some of the other subcommittee efforts. Thank you.
Very good. Mayor Tuck.
Go ahead, Mayor Duman.
Now you've hurt my feelings. No, I'm serious. I'll get over it easy.
My apologies,
Oh,
sir.
no, I'll get over it easy. Number one, I want to thank everyone for their efforts. Ms. Bunning, Chip, I mean, this is some impressive stuff in a short period of time. And I couldn't agree more with you. I took a couple of notes here. Getting the schools involved, I believe, is a must. I mean, we can't take, I mean, I think everyone will agree that no one is born a criminal. So some type of we got to work collaboratively with the school system to have possibly, I know our sheriff's department in the past has been very active in the schools. As far as speaking to the students, them not feeling adversarial with law enforcement, talking about drugs, talking about gangs, providing a little bit of guidance, if you will. The schools offer the only ability for us to communicate with those juveniles at that time. I mean, to try to go into the neighborhoods one at a time, and we want to talk to them here, we want to talk to them there. This is a place where we can talk to them. And along with that goes the workforce development and talking about jobs, and it's just kind of mushrooms from there. So I really think getting the schools involved is going to be a huge factor. The collaboration with information, like I said, the bullet points, you know, where homicides being committed, where larceny being committed. And to my point is, homicide, is it being perpetrated by what I call a career criminal? Stealing a car, breaking into a home, committing a robbery? Is it being committed by a gang member, which is a separate issue? Is it strictly drug related? Separate issue. Is it societal to the point where maybe additional supervision would have prevented it? Mental health initiative would have prevented it. The fact that if they had a job, maybe it would have prevented it. But I think without that analysis, we really don't know where to best use our resources, because we're not going to do it all at one time. There's, just to Mayor Alexander's point, there's going to be short time, midterm, and God knows it could take a couple of generations, because just like perception, it doesn't change overnight. This, where we are as a society, didn't evolve over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. This has been 10, 20, 30 years in the making as to what we consider to be acceptable in our society. Like Mayor Dyer said, I mean, when I was in school, God forbid the teacher said, here, take this note home to your mother. And compare that to what's happening now. So I think that it's going to be imperative that we look at that. All these other regional strategies are great. Our law enforcement officers being tied up, taking people to find adequate mental health care or having to babysit. And I'm also on the board of the regional jail, and Amanda tell you, we run into that also. You know, where we have to transport, and we are required by law now to find a bed somewhere. And if it's 3 or 4 hours from here, then you go 3 or 4 hours. Well, this is taking our law enforcement folks off the street to have something that could be done by someone else. And the type of things that we're talking about, speaking to our legislators in regards to what we would like to see, if we can do that as a group from this body collectively, this is what we're looking for. This is what we want. This is what we need if you want to address this problem. And then, of course, we can each back it up individually, but coming from the PDC or wherever it is, and I know you've done that before, I think that's huge. But I am looking forward to more of these conversations. I mean, I've already written a few things down. We're getting ready to take some initiatives in Suffolk, and I don't mind admitting it, and I've said it before, we are behind the curve. I look at what Portsmouth's done, I look at what Norfolk's done, I look at what Hampton's done, I look at what Virginia Beach has done, and we haven't done a lot of that. Of course, the silver lining to that cloud is we hadn't felt like we needed to do a lot of that. But obviously, we do. We need to get in the game. We need to be proactive. And that's absolutely what we intend on doing. So this whole concept, this regional concept for us has been a blessing, and I think the city manager will agree to that also. It is going to help us formulate our policies and our initiatives, so I greatly appreciate it and be more than happy to be part of anything we can be part of. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mayor. On to Mayor Tuck.
Just thinking, no wise mayor would contradict his city manager in public. But I want to say that I thought it was an excellent presentation by Mrs. Bunning and Dr. Fowler. And one of the things I was just thinking, first of all, we've been at this for quite some time, so I think that's what this fishbone reflects. And then the second thing is what Mayor Duman said, in addition to some other comments, is I think his observations are why we are here. The things that Dr. Fowler outlined in his point number 2, the fact is that, I think we will all come out of this stronger and better because of the sharing of ideas. If we walk away with 1 or 2 things, and I think that's important. And I think even from discussions in the first meeting, and I took a lot of notes too, that the CEOs were able to put that together and come up with these ideas along with next steps. And so I'm hoping that, again, we will see those things we can do regionally, and we'll commit ourselves to doing those things. And then the things that work for our localities, we will continue to do those, as well as be willing to share those things. Again, everything may not work for us in each locality, but I'm sure out of the different things that have been presented here and things that will come through continued commitments and discussions, that will be more piece parts that we can apply, and so we can really make a dent at it. But again, I think the important part of it is for us to remain committed to the process.
Thank you, sir. So if I can review, it sounds like we believe that the subcommittee has come up with a good comprehensive strategy. Looking to Mary and Chip, it feels like a good next step might be for us to convene as CAOs and think about what structure looks like, think about how the efforts organize in terms of stakeholders. It's going to be a number of subcommittees. We have to think about who leads those. Mary, what do you think would be a good time for us to maybe come up with that strategy before we might report back to this group what that structure might look like to move forward?
Well, as we're all getting our budgets adopted in the next couple of weeks, hopefully, it would be helpful if we had at least a month to come together and, put together the next part. We didn't want to go too far without getting your concurrence today on the general approach, but I think within a month, we should be able to come back with some additional details.
So if that sounds reasonable, that we might look at our next meeting either, and I know summer months can be difficult, but in that late June, get past the 4th of July holiday, probably mid-July timeframe. Does that sound reasonable for our next report back for this group on progress?
While emphasizing that all of our cities are continuing to do things. For those in the audience or those in the media or those who might watch a media story, we're not waiting for meetings to make things happen.
Absolutely.
But I do think that to advance some of these regional collaborations, we're going to need a little bit of time to get together, and everybody's really busy right now with budgets. So I think that's a good time frame for the regional next step.
Okay.
Yeah, Bob, I would say one thing. I think one thing Mary and I think could do, and do it pretty quick, I would suspect, as with our budget, and I think the budget Mary's proposing, there are spends in there for some of these things, right? So what Mary and I talked about the other day was with those budgets and the ones that get adopted, really quickly reaching out to our colleagues just with a quick survey of where their spends are and what they're spending on in this space, so that we can get a feel for the opportunities to do perhaps some joint procurements. But I think we could jump on that pretty quick, and we're right there now anyways, because everybody's adopting budgets.
Right, great point. Mayor, did you have something to add?
Yeah, if I could just, make a point of personal privilege. First of all, I just want to thank everybody that if you think what we've accomplished, the operative word being we, with the hard work of a lot of people, it's amazing when you think about it. And I just think it shows our public that we're taking this serious and going forward. We do have a member in the audience I'd like to recognize, and that's Jim Savara, former police chief. and he is co-chairing Virginia Beach's initiative. But Jim has also been very active with the National Chief of Police's. And the best thing to do is look at best practices everywhere. And then Mary, 100%, find out, what's going to be working. And, you're right, Mike, this may take a long time, to get it done, but shame on us if we don't take those first steps. And Jim, I want to thank you and thank the people in the audience that have taken time to come and care. Thank you.
Any other comments? Questions? So I think we have our consensus and direction. We will convene with the CAOs and look to report back to this group in about a 2-month time frame. As we mentioned, recognizing progress and work's going to keep happening. Thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate it.
Good stuff.